At the onset of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, armored warfare was still a relatively new concept for the Chinese forces. Unlike many of the Western nations, whose experience with tanks dates all the way back to the First World War, fighting in China was still mostly done by the infantry. When all-out war with Japan started, the Chinese military was still experimenting with armored warfare and had a lot to learn. This video will introduce one of China's first modern armored units, the Armored Regiment, and talk about its organization. Before I continue, there are a few things to note. Many English sources incorrectly refer to the Chinese Armored Regiment as the Chinese Armored Corps and state that there were 3 tank battalions in this unit. This misconception is likely due to a mistake in translation, and instead of having 3 tank battalions, there were only 3 tank companies in a single battalion. Although photos and footage of this unit can be hard to come by, I have been able to find a number of them to use in this video. As a result, unless otherwise stated, all of the images in this video will show the actual vehicles and equipment that were used by the Chinese forces. The first tanks to arrive in China were Renault FT-17s, which were imported during the 1920s by the warlord Zhang Zuolin. Although the central Chinese government would eventually acquire a few of these tanks as well, their extremely limited number meant that they did not play an important role in the military, and were mainly used for training. The importation of tanks only started to increase during the mid-1930s as China began to modernize its military with the help from nations such as Germany. Early encounters with Japanese armor, such as during the First Battle of Shanghai in 1932, also known as the January 28th incident, had demonstrated to the Chinese the importance of armored warfare. There, Chinese infantry came across the newly introduced Type 89 medium tank, which was armed with a 57mm main gun, as well as 2 6.5mm machine guns. Through these encounters, the Chinese military realized that not only did they need good anti-tank weapons, they also needed tanks of their own. Most of the tanks and armored vehicles that China used during the war would be imported from other countries due to China's limited production capabilities. Although some units would experiment with making their own armored vehicles, mostly armored cars built on foreign-made truck chassis, their unreliability and limited numbers meant that they would only play a very limited role during the war. Initially, there was little standardization, and various types of armored vehicles were purchased from a wide range of European nations. This would make China one of the only countries to have used at least one type of armored vehicle from every major nation that participated in World War II, including France, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany, Italy, and Japan. However, these vehicles were imported or used at different points in the war, some later than others. As a result, I will only be talking about a few of these vehicles in today's video. Many of the vehicles imported during the mid-1930s would be sent to training academies and schools to help train troops in their use. However, in May of 1937, following the arrival of another shipment of military equipment, including tanks, it was finally decided to merge some of these units to form the Armored Regiment, one of China's first modern armored units, consisting of not only armored vehicles, but also reconnaissance units, anti-tank units, infantry support, and many more. Command of this regiment was given to Major General Du Yuming, who had previously been an officer at the Jiaozi or Transportation Academy. A first-term graduate from the prestigious Whampoa or Huangpu Military Academy, Du Yuming would eventually become one of the most well-known Chinese generals of World War II. The Armored Regiment initially consisted of the following units: a fighting vehicle battalion, a reconnaissance battalion, an anti-tank gun battalion, an anti-tank gun training unit that consisted of 3 training battalions, a supplementary battalion, a preparatory battalion, an anti-aircraft battalion, a repair depot, as well as other smaller units. The fighting vehicle battalion was under the command of Colonel Hu Xianqun and consisted of 4 companies, with the first 3 companies being equipped with tanks and 4th company being responsible for their resupply. The first company was equipped with 16 Vickers 6-ton Mark E tanks. This company was sometimes referred to as the Tiger Company, due to the Chinese character for tiger being painted in white on the left side of the turret. A vehicle number was also painted on the right side. In addition to the tiger character and vehicle number, each tank also had either a circle, square, or shield painted around the character and number, which denoted the platoon that the tank belonged to. These markings were all carried over from their previous unit and were not updated after the formation of the Armored Regiment. The 6-ton Mark E tanks in Chinese service were of the Type B variant, with a single turret, instead of the dual machine gun turret variant known as the Type A. However, The Type A variant also found its way to Asia, as sources suggest that Japan purchased 1 or 2 of the Type A's for testing, with one seen here in this photo on the far right next to a captured Chinese Panzer I and 6-ton Type B tank. The first company of the Fighting Vehicle Battalion was made up of 3 platoons, with 5 tanks each, while the final tank belonged to company headquarters. Each tank had a crew of 3, a driver, a gunner, and a commander, armed with a 47mm main gun, as well as a coaxial Vickers machine gun. The Vickers 6-ton tank was one of, if not the best tank in Chinese service at the time. 3 batches of Mark E tanks would be ordered by the Chinese military in the mid-1930s. The 4 tanks from the last shipment had an upgraded turret that held a Marconi radio, which was specifically requested by the Chinese. These tanks would be the command tanks, used by the platoon commanders and company headquarters. These command tanks did not appear to have any of the turret markings that were on the regular 6-ton tanks from the first company. The second company had 16 Vickers Carden-Loyd light amphibious tanks. This company was sometimes known as the Dragon Company, due to the Chinese character for dragon being painted on the left side of the turret. Like the first company, these tanks also had a vehicle number painted on the right side, and also had a circle, square, or shield to denote their platoon. Also like the first company, there were 3 platoons, with each of the platoons having 5 tanks, while Company HQ had 1. Each tank had a crew of 2, a driver, and a gunner, who operated the vehicle's single Vickers heavy machine gun. While these tanks did lack in armaments, they were unique among the Armored Regiment as they were amphibious and were capable of crossing deep bodies of water that were off limits to the other vehicles. Propulsion in water was achieved through a propeller attached to the rear of the tanks. This meant that if used correctly, they still had the potential to play an important role on the battlefield. It has been theorized by some that a number of Vickers 6-ton tanks were also given to the second company to boost its combat capabilities. Surprisingly, the Armored Regiment wasn't the only unit in China that had these Vickers Carden-Loyd light amphibious tanks. The Yue, or Guangdong Army in southern China, also had a number of these tanks, in addition to numerous armored cars in their fighting vehicle unit. Although these tanks had the same camouflage pattern, there were no markings on the turrets. Instead, the vehicle number was painted on the side of the hulls. The third company was equipped with German-manufactured Panzer Kampfwagen I Ausführung A tanks. Ordered in 1936, the tanks arrived in mid-1937 and were immediately placed in the Armored Regiment, replacing the Carden-Loyd tankettes in Chinese service, which were not included in this unit. The Panzer I's were likely painted in the pre-war German 3-color camouflage, although it's also possible that they had the later 2-color camouflage pattern, which came out in 1937. Some of the Panzer I's had a vehicle number painted on the front of the tank next to the driver's vision port. A few sources suggest that the Panzer I's also had a Chinese nationalist insignia painted on the side of the tanks towards the rear. The few period photos of the tanks that exist, though, seem to suggest otherwise, as it shows that area to be devoid of any markings. However, some tanks that were captured by the Japanese have been photographed to bear the nationalist insignia on the front of the hull. These were most likely added afterwards by the Japanese, as the tanks that do bear this marking were all on display in Japan. None of the Panzer I's photographed in China appear to have this marking. This company had 3 platoons, which had 4 or 5 tanks assigned to each, with sources varying between whether each platoon had 4 or 5 tanks. With Company HQ having 2 tanks instead of 1, this placed a total number of Panzer I's in the 3rd Company at 14 or 17. The Panzer I had a crew of 2, a driver and a gunner, who operated the 2 7.92mm MG-13 machine guns. Many English sources incorrectly claim that some of the tanks had their MG-13s replaced with the Soviet 7.62mm DP machine guns. The tanks in these photos, in fact, still had their original MG-13s in place. The confusion is most likely due to the conical flash hiders of the MG-13 bearing some resemblance to that of the DPs. The same flash hiders can be seen on the MG-13s from the Chinese STKFZ 221, 222, and 223 armored cars. The open turret of the armored cars allows for a closer look at the MG-13 machine guns, where one can see that the barrel and flash hider are indeed identical to those found on the Panzer Is. Next up is the Reconnaissance Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Xiao Pingbo, which consisted of 3 reconnaissance companies. The first company had 36 German-made Zundab motorcycles, split evenly among 3 platoons, imported along with other German equipment in the mid-1930s. The ones in Chinese service were from the K-series. The Zundab motorcycles of First Company had sidecars attached and were often referred to in Chinese as the 3-wheeled motorcycle. It is also possible that different types of sidecars were used, as this photo shows a different sidecar variant with a Type 24 heavy machine gun mounted on it. Some sources have suggested that the First Company also used Harley-Davidson motorcycles, possibly of the RL-45 model. Like the first reconnaissance company, the second company also had 36 Zundab K-series motorcycles, also split between 3 platoons. However, the ones from the second company were regular 2-wheeled variants and did not have the sidecars attached. The third company consisted of 3 platoons and was equipped with 12 German-made light armored reconnaissance vehicles, the SD KFZ-221. Each vehicle had a single 7.92mm MG-13 machine gun mounted on the turret. Other sources suggest that in addition to the 4 SD-KFZ-221s, each platoon also had 2 SD-KFZ-222s and 1 SD-KFZ-223, with Company HQ also having a single 223. In addition to the MG-13, the SD-KFZ-222s were also armed with a 20mm cannon, while the 223s had a single MG-13 and an upgraded radio and frame antenna. Purchased from Germany in the mid to late 30s, these vehicles in fact had a number of early features not commonly seen on the standard German ones, including the early tire tread patterns, as well as the earlier patterned vision ports, which were simple slits cut directly into the armor, as opposed to the later cast version. Another noticeable external difference would be the position of the cannon and the machine gun on the Chinese SD-KFZ-222s. While the German version had the machine gun on the left side of the turret, the Chinese contract vehicles had their machine guns on the right. The next unit in the Armored Regiment is the Anti-Tank Battalion, which consisted of 4 companies under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Kangzhan. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd companies had the same organization and equipment, with each company being armed with 6 German-made 37mm PaK 35/36 anti-tank guns. These guns were slightly different from many of the ones used by the infantry units, as these were the mechanized version, with metal wheels and pneumatic tires. Many of the 37mm PaKs that were given to the infantry units had the earlier spoked wooden wheels and were horse-drawn, instead of the 37mm PaKs. The 4th company was armed with 6 Italian-manufactured 47/32 model 1935 47mm anti-tank guns. Originally designed by the Austrian company Böhler, these guns were made under license by Breda in Italy. Each company also had a number of German-made Mercedes-Benz Type 320 Wehrmacht Kubelwagons to tow the anti-tank guns. Although these were not the Volkswagen Kubelwagons that many of us are used to, they were also used by the German Wehrmacht during the Second World War. The role of the Kubelwagons was not limited to the transport of anti-tank guns. They were also used as a general-purpose military vehicle and also served as a staff car. Due to their usefulness, these Kubelwagons were distributed to units throughout the Armored Regiment. However, based off this photo of a Chinese anti-tank gun unit, it is evident that there are differences between the vehicle in the front and those in the rear, including different fender shapes and different bumper types. As a result, it is also quite possible that more than one model or variation was used in these units. It should also be noted that one of the earlier batches of 37mm PaKs imported into China came with Krupp Proza trucks. As very little information is available about these trucks in Chinese service, it is unknown if they were ever used by the Armored Regiment. But, considering the fact that they were also imported along with the 37mm PaKs, it should be appropriate to mention them here as well. The limited information that exists, however, suggests that these trucks were not considered suitable for towing the anti-tank guns in China, and may have been transferred to the German 10.5cm howitzer units soon after their importation. Almost no images exist of these trucks in Chinese service. The image that you see here is the only one I was able to find, showing one of these Chinese trucks on display in Japan after being captured. The only footage that I'm aware of is a very short segment from a Japanese newsreel taken after the Battle of Nanking, showing a single captured Proza behind a number of Japanese trucks. providing evidence that not only were these trucks used in China, but were also likely used during the defense of Nanking. Also attached to the armored regiment was an anti-tank gun training unit under the command of Colonel Feng Erjun. This unit had a total of 3 battalions, with each battalion consisting of 3 companies. Like the previously mentioned anti-tank gun battalion, each company from the 3 training battalions also had 6 37mm PaK 35/36 anti-tank guns. The supplementary battalion of the armored regiment could be used to provide a limited amount of infantry support for the other units. Consisting of 3 infantry companies under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Gao Jiren, the organization was roughly the same as an infantry battalion from a reorganized or German-trained infantry division, with each company having 3 platoons, and each platoon consisting of 3 squads. Each squad had a ZB-26 light machine gun, while the rest of the men were armed with 8mm bolt-action rifles. The preparatory battalion consisted of personnel under training or cadets that could be used to reinforce frontline units in times of battle. This unit was made up of 3 companies and was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Han Zengdong. The armored regiment also included a repair depot, as well as other smaller-sized units, such as those responsible for communications, special operations, and so on. When initially formed in May of 1937, an anti-aircraft battalion was also included in the armored regiment. This anti-aircraft battalion was initially the first battalion of the Anti-Aircraft or Air Defense Academy, located in Nanking. Unlike some of the anti-aircraft guns that many other Chinese units had, this academy had some of the most advanced anti-aircraft guns in China at the time, including the Bofors 75mm M1929 anti-aircraft guns. Although these were never used by the German Wehrmacht, the M1929 can be considered to be the predecessor of the famous 8.8cm anti-aircraft guns like the Flak 18, more commonly known as the Flak 88s. The Academy also had at its disposal a number of Vickers artillery tractors, or Vickers Dragons, to tow their anti-aircraft guns. Although initially attached to the armored regiment, within a month, in June of 1937, the anti-aircraft battalion was returned to the Anti-Aircraft Academy. Full-scale war with Japan would break out soon after the regiment's formation. Units from the armored regiment would participate in some of the earliest engagements, including the Battle of Shanghai and the defense of Nanking. However, due to the combination of a number of different factors, including inexperienced crews, poor coordination with the infantry, as well as questionable decisions made by those higher up along the chain of command, the regiment would suffer heavy losses during these early battles.